Ever wondered what kept medieval women awake at night? What spiritual terrors haunted their daily lives in ways we can barely imagine today? Number 9. The fear of being labeled a witch. Did you know a woman could be accused of witchcraft for something as simple as knowing how to treat a fever? In medieval Europe, the line between healer and witch was dangerously thin. Women who possessed knowledge of herbal remedies walked a treacherous path. A successful cure might be celebrated one day and used as evidence of demonic powers the next. Take Agnes Waterhouse, the first woman executed for witchcraft in England in 1566. Her crime? Owning a white cat named Satan that she allegedly used to harm neighbors and their livestock. The truth behind many witch accusations was far more mundane. A woman who lived alone, who inherited property when women weren't supposed to have economic power, or who simply knew too much about medicine. Religious authorities taught that women were inherently more susceptible to the devil's influence. The infamous witch-hunting manual, Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, stated, "All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which in women is insatiable." This text became the handbook for witch hunters throughout Europe, embedding the association between femininity and evil. Women lived knowing that unexplained deaths in the community, sudden illnesses, or even bad weather could result in an accusatory finger pointed their way. A medieval woman's reputation was her only shield, and once tarnished, it was nearly impossible to restore the punishment. Horrific torture followed by public execution, hanging in England, burning at the stake in continental Europe. For medieval women, the witch label wasn't just a Halloween costume. It was a death sentence hanging over their heads. Number 8. The fear of purgatory and hell. Can you imagine believing that your smallest sins could condemn you to eternal torment? Medieval women carried this burden day in and day out. The church painted vivid images of hell's torments, demons tearing flesh, souls writhing in flames, and specialized tortures for specific sins. These weren't abstract concepts, but living realities in the medieval mind. Church walls bore graphic frescoes of the damned suffering. In the famous Last Judgment tympanum at Bourges Cathedral, sinners are shown being boiled alive, devoured by demons, and worse. Women were taught that their feminine weaknesses made them especially vulnerable to sin and damnation. Purgatory posed, perhaps, an even more immediate fear. Introduced as doctrine in the 12th century, purgatory was a temporary hell where souls were cleansed of venial sins before entering heaven. Medieval calculations estimated purgatorial suffering could last thousands of years. Women feared dying without proper confession, condemning their souls to this prolonged agony. Marjorie Kempe, whose autobiography represents the oldest known in English, described her terror of damnation so vividly that modern psychologists might diagnose her with religious trauma. She wrote about visions of demons coming to drag her to hell, torments so terrifying. She contemplated suicide, which, ironically, would have guaranteed her damnation. The fear was so pervasive that wealthy women left substantial portions of their estates to pay for masses to be said for their souls after death. Those without means worried their souls would languish longer in purgatory without prayers purchased on their behalf. For medieval women, death wasn't the end of suffering, but potentially just the beginning. Number 7. The fear of female sexuality. How would you feel if your natural desires were considered the gateway to eternal damnation? Medieval religious doctrine painted female sexuality as dangerous, polluting, and inherently sinful. Women were told their bodies were sources of temptation that could lead men, even holy men, astray. Religious texts frequently cited Eve's role in the fall, using it to justify the regulation of female bodies and desires. Saint Jerome, whose writings heavily influenced medieval Christianity, wrote, "Adam was deceived by Eve, not Eve by Adam. It is right that he whom woman led into sin should be received back and guided by her to salvation." Women's menstruation was viewed with particular suspicion. Church doctrine prohibited menstruating women from receiving communion or entering churches based on Old Testament purity laws. Medieval medical texts described menstrual blood as toxic, capable of poisoning crops and turning wine sour. Hildegard von Bingen, despite being a respected abbess and mystic, wrote that menstrual blood contained harmful humors that could cause leprosy. Even within marriage, sexual pleasure for women was considered suspect. The medieval penitential manuals used by priests during confession listed elaborate sexual prohibitions and required detailed questioning about marital relations. Women who enjoyed intercourse too much might be assigned severe penances. The Church sanctioned sex only for procreation, in the missionary position, and preferably without enjoyment for unmarried women. Virginity was simultaneously the highest virtue and a constant source of anxiety. A woman's value was tied directly to her sexual purity, yet she lived in a world where that purity could be violently taken from her. Once lost, a woman's reputation, and often her entire future, was irreparably damaged. The religious glorification of virginity created a paradox where women's bodies were simultaneously sacred vessels and dangerous temptations requiring constant vigilance. Number 6. The fear of childbirth damnation. Did you know that dying during childbirth carried a spiritual double penalty? Medieval women faced not only the very real physical dangers of childbirth, but also terrifying spiritual consequences. Death during labor was frighteningly common with some historians, estimating that between 5 to 15% of women died during or shortly after childbirth. The Church taught that the pain of childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's sin. Genesis chapter 3 verse 16 was frequently cited. "In pain you shall bring forth children." This suffering wasn't just physical but carried deep theological significance. Women's pain was divinely ordained punishment for female sin. More terrifying still was the Church teaching that women who died during childbirth without having their last rites performed could be denied Christian burial or entry to heaven. In remote areas where priests might not arrive in time for a complicated birth, women faced their labor knowing their eternal soul was at risk. Women also feared for their unborn children. Unbaptized infants couldn't enter heaven according to Church doctrine. Instead, they were consigned to limbo, limbus infantium, a border realm neither heaven nor hell. This belief was so strong that there were emergency baptism procedures for stillborn infants and partially born babies during difficult deliveries. Folklore added to these fears with stories of changelings, fairy children supposedly swapped for human babies, and beliefs that demons targeted women in childbirth. Protective charms and prayers to Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, were common. Women would borrow birthing girdles, strips of parchment inscribed with prayers, from local churches to wear during labor for spiritual protection. The combination of very real physical danger and deeply ingrained spiritual terror made childbirth a profound ordeal. For medieval women, bringing life into the world meant confronting death and damnation simultaneously. Number 5. The fear of female leadership and authority. Have you ever been told you couldn't do something simply because of your gender? Medieval women lived entire lives under such restrictions, with religious doctrine providing the justification. The Church's teaching on female subordination was clear and unyielding, drawn from passages like 1 Timothy 2:12. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. Women who displayed leadership qualities or sought authority faced suspicion, censure, and sometimes accusations of heresy. When Joan of Arc claimed divine guidance to lead French troops, her authority was acceptable only as a divine exception. When her usefulness ended, the theological establishment quickly condemned her for wearing men's clothing, a transgression against natural order that helped justify her execution. Religious doctrines especially restricted women's voices in spiritual matters. Women were prohibited from preaching, administering sacraments, or interpreting scripture independently. The rare female mystics who gained influence, like Julian of Norwich or Hildegard of Bingen, had to carefully frame their revelations as coming directly from God rather than their own understanding. Convents offered the closest thing to female authority structures, but even these were ultimately subject to male oversight. The 13th century begins. Lay religious women who lived in independent communities without formal vows were viewed with such suspicion that many were persecuted as heretics precisely because they operated outside male control. Women internalized these restrictions, fearing divine punishment for stepping outside prescribed roles. Christina of Marquette's 12th century hagiography describes her terror when resisting an arranged marriage, requiring divine reassurance that her desire for independence wasn't sinful pride. The message was constant. Female authority was unnatural, dangerous, and against God's plan. Number 4. The fear of bodily impurity. Can you imagine being considered fundamentally unclean simply because of your biology? Medieval women lived with religious teachings that characterized their bodies as inherently impure. Church fathers like Tertullian described women as the devil's gateway, while influential theological texts detailed how female bodies were physically inferior to male bodies, colder, moister, and more susceptible to corruption. Religious doctrines surrounding childbirth included purification rituals before women could re-enter church spaces. The ceremony of churching after childbirth explicitly treated new mothers as ritually unclean until they had been purified. While officially presented as a blessing, the practical effect was to treat natural female biological functions as spiritually contaminating. Women were prohibited from approaching the altar during menstruation, and complex rules governed when husbands could have intercourse with their wives based on the female cycle. Medieval penitential manuals, handbooks for confessors, listed penances for men who had relations with menstruating women, treating such acts as serious spiritual transgressions. Religious art reinforced these ideas. The Virgin Mary was typically depicted wearing blue, symbolizing purity and heaven, while Eve and Mary Magdalene, often incorrectly portrayed as a reformed prostitute, were shown in red, symbolizing carnality and sin. The message was clear. Female purity was rare, exceptional, and impossible for ordinary women to achieve. Even women's tears were suspect. While male mystics' weeping was often celebrated as divine gift, women's crying had to be carefully regulated. Too many tears might indicate manipulation or hysteria rather than genuine devotion. The 14th century mystic Marjorie Kempe was frequently criticized for her dramatic weeping, with church authorities questioning whether her tears came from God or the devil. Living in bodies constantly characterized as polluting vessels created profound psychological burdens. Medieval women performed endless rituals of purification and penitence, seeking to transcend what religious doctrine told them was their inherently corrupt nature. Number 3. The fear of insufficient devotion. What if your prayers weren't enough to save your soul? Medieval women lived under constant pressure to demonstrate perfect piety, while being told their gender made them spiritually weaker. The Church taught women were more susceptible to sin and less capable of spiritual discipline, creating a nearly impossible standard. Women's devotional practices were simultaneously encouraged and scrutinized. Too little devotion indicated sinful worldliness, but too much might suggest pride or even heresy. Female mystics walked this tightrope carefully. When Catherine of Siena described her mystical marriage to Christ, she emphasized her unworthiness and obedience to church authority, knowing claims of direct divine communication could be dangerous. The fear of performing inadequate devotion drove women to extreme practices. Some adopted severe fasting that modern doctors would classify as anorexia nervosa. The holy anorexia of medieval saints like Catherine of Siena, who eventually died of starvation, was celebrated as evidence of spiritual dedication through bodily denial. For ordinary women, such practices were born of genuine fear that their souls depended on perfect devotional performance. Prayer itself became a source of anxiety. Women were expected to pray frequently, but were also taught that improper prayers could be worse than no prayer at all. Various manuals provided instructions on proper physical posture, mental attitude, and verbal formulations. Making mistakes in prayers, especially during crucial moments like deathbed confessions, could have eternal consequences. Religious iconography reminded women of their spiritual inadequacy. Church art frequently featured female figures representing vices like vanity and lust, while virtues were more often portrayed as male. The ever-present images of the Virgin Mary set an impossible standard, simultaneously virgin and mother, perfectly humble yet exalted above all women. The constant self-monitoring required by these beliefs created what modern psychologists might call religious scrupulosity, an obsessive concern about committing unrecognized sins. Medieval women's diaries and confessions revealed recurring patterns of anxiety about whether their devotion was sufficient to overcome what they had been taught was their natural female weakness. Number 2. The fear of demonic possession. Did you know medieval women were considered particularly vulnerable to demonic influence? The Church taught that women's supposedly weaker minds and moral characters made them prime targets for diabolic possession. This wasn't abstract theology, but a terrifying daily possibility. Medical conditions like epilepsy, hysteria, or even unusual behaviors could be interpreted as signs of demonic influence. Women who experienced unexplained physical symptoms lived in fear of being labeled possessed. The treatment. Exorcism rituals that were often traumatic in themselves, involving physical restraint, forced fasting, and sometimes physical violence believed necessary to drive out demons. Religious texts warned that demons could enter through any female sin, particularly those involving vanity or sexuality. A woman who took too much pride in her appearance might be inviting demonic attention. Even dreams could be dangerous. Nocturnal emissions or erotic dreams were sometimes interpreted as evidence of demonic incubi visiting women in their sleep. The fear extended beyond possession itself to the social consequences. Women labeled as possessed faced permanent stigma, difficulties finding marriage partners, and ongoing suspicion. Some historians suggest that accusations of possession were sometimes used to control women who defied social norms, making conformity a matter of self-preservation. Preventive measures dominated women's lives. They were taught to pray constantly, avoid being alone, especially at night, and wear protective amulets blessed by priests. The medieval Book of Hours, containing prayers for different times of day, was particularly popular among women who could afford them, offering spiritual protection against demonic influence throughout the day. For medieval women, demons weren't Halloween characters, but real entities actively seeking their spiritual and physical ruin. The fear of possession created a state of constant vigilance, where every thought, feeling, and physical sensation might be evidence of demonic activity requiring confession and intervention. Number 1. The fear of failing as wife and mother. Have you ever felt you weren't living up to someone else's expectations? Medieval women carried the burden of impossibly perfect standards for wifehood and motherhood, with eternal consequences for failure. Religious doctrine established rigid definitions of the good wife and mother, based largely on biblical passages and patristic writings. The ideal wife described in religious texts was submissive, silent, industrious, and eternally patient. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, 24. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, was preached regularly. Women were taught that resistance to their husband's authority was not just a marital problem, but a sin against divine order. Marriage manuals and sermons emphasized wifely obedience as a Christian duty. Motherhood carried even more complex religious expectations. Women were taught they were responsible not just for children's physical well-being, but for their immortal souls. A child who strayed from faith reflected maternal failure. Mothers were expected to model perfect virtue while raising children according to strict religious principles. The Virgin Mary's impossible standard, perfect motherhood without sexuality, loomed over every medieval mother. The consequences for failing weren't merely social, but eternal. Confessional manuals listed sins specific to wives and mothers: insufficient respect for husbands, negligence in children's religious education, or complaining about household duties. Women confessed these failings with genuine fear for their salvation. Medieval exemplary literature highlighted saintly wives who endured extraordinary abuse with patience. The popular story of patient Griselda, who remained obedient while her husband pretended to kill their children to test her loyalty, was presented as an aspirational model. Such stories reinforced the message that a wife's spiritual duty was to endure any treatment without complaint. For women who couldn't have children, religious doctrine created additional anxiety. Infertility was typically blamed on women and often interpreted as divine punishment for sin. Barren women undertook pilgrimages, special prayers, and penances, seeking to reverse what was seen as God's disfavor. The psychological burden of these expectations was immense. Women's personal writings reveal recurring patterns of self-blame and anxiety about their adequacy as wives and mothers. The religious framing of these roles meant that ordinary human failures weren't just disappointing, but potentially damning. Have you ever imagined how differently you might view yourself if every aspect of your gender identity was treated as spiritually dangerous? How might centuries of these fears still echo in religious teachings about women today?